the Financial Sense Midweek Edition with Jim Paplava. Delving in depth with authors and experts into the key economic issues. Today's host is the senior editor for Financial Sense, Cris Sheridan.
A while back, George Soros gave a speech at the Cato Institute titled, "Why I Agree with Some of Friedrich Hayek." It generated a very lively discussion, including a follow-up response by our guest today, James Custores, who says that Soros didn't quite have his story straight when it came to this very famous and generally misunderstood economist, Friedrich Hayek. James, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
Now, James, you're a securities analyst. You're a consultant for institutions as a global portfolio strategist. I know you write a lot of different financial commentaries on Seeking Alpha, TheStreet.com, and other places as well. But, in this follow-up response that you did to Soros, it's clear you have a pretty good understanding of Hayek, which I thought was really fascinating. So let's get into this. Can you explain to us who is Friedrich Hayek exactly, and what were some of his major contributions?
Hayek to the public is known for having won the Nobel Prize in 1974. He won the Nobel Prize, according to the Nobel Committee, for two major contributions that he had made at the time. One were his contributions to a debate that was known as the Socialist Calculation Debate, which at the time was a very important debate about to what extent central government planners could actually properly calculate all the different inputs and outputs that would be needed for an economy to be productive. And Hayek made very significant contributions in that debate and essentially demonstrated that the central planning in the socialist mode was going to be, in most cases, an inferior economic system. So Hayek demonstrated that because information in a modern economy is so incredibly dispersed amongst millions of players that are located all over the world, that it would be very extremely difficult for any central planner to be able to centralize all this information in order to make economically efficient decisions. But what Hayek demonstrated was that individual entrepreneurs and market actors acting on localized information actually had better information at their disposal to make economic decisions and actually to make the economic system as a whole work than central planners had. And that was a key insight that he helped to bring forth and earned him the Nobel Prize. The second area where his contributions were cited in terms of the Nobel Prize was his work on business cycle theory. And he developed during the early 1930s and early 1940s a theory of business cycles that continues to be debated today in today's economy, and we can maybe talk about that a little bit later. The interesting thing is that Hayek won his Nobel Prize in 1974, but he didn't die until 1991. And basically, he was productive as an academic and as an intellectual pretty much right up until the point of his death. In fact, his last book, which I believe was actually one of his greatest books, was published in 1989, just a couple years before he died.
Which book was that, by the way?
The Fatal Conceit. We can talk about that one a little bit later if you'd like. But I guess the important thing to point out here is between 1974, which is when he won his Nobel Prize, and 1991, that's quite a few years, and he made quite a few contributions after that as well, including an extension on his work on spontaneous order and some other things that I think we'll probably touch on as we go on in this interview. Hayek made important contributions well beyond the field of economics, which is probably what he's best known for. He's also became well known and made probably even larger contributions to the field of political philosophy, where he wrote one of the most important books of the 20th century called The Road to Serfdom. This is a book that's been consistently cited as one of the most influential books of the 20th century, and I think without any doubt it was. And he also wrote some other influential books in political philosophy, one called The Constitution of Liberty, and the other one called Law, Legislation, and Liberty, which is actually a three-part sort of magnum opus that he wrote towards the end of his career. He also made contributions in the field of psychology. He's an author that's cited today and works on sociology and anthropology. Hayek also, I think, made a very important contribution that's maybe not as recognized, which is that he founded an organization called the Mont Pelerin Society. This was a society that he founded right after World War II to try to bring together pro-liberty oriented scholars from around the world. As you know, right after World War II, socialism was definitely in vogue and it was on the ascendant. And sort of free market, more liberty-oriented ideas were definitely on the retreat. And Hayek, in founding the Mont Pelerin Society, actually did something that was, I think, extremely important in intellectual history, which is actually bring together a lot of very important thinkers that weren't necessarily libertarians or free market type of guys in the sense that we would understand it today, but a fairly broad spectrum of scholars, many of whom were or later became Nobel Prize winners. And by bringing these people together every single year, and some of the people that participated in this, just to give you an example, were Milton Friedman, Karl Popper, Frank Knight, George Stigler. There was a number of very, very important Nobel Prize winning economists, political philosophers that participated in the Mont Pelerin Society for a number of years. And this group really helped to form the basis of sort of counteracting the sort of socialist and communist onslaught that happened after World War II and laid the foundation for sort of the neoliberal reawakening that happened in the late 70s and early 80s, and that sort of laid the foundations for Margaret Thatcher in England and Ronald Reagan in the United States. But probably none of that would have really happened if Hayek hadn't actually brought together a lot of these intellectuals through the Mont Pelerin Society to kind of exchange ideas, to kind of provide each other with both intellectual and to some extent emotional support. I think that was actually one of his most important contributions, really, which was to found the society. And he was its president for, I think, about 15 or 16 years. So his contributions are very vast. Today, like I said, he's mainly caricatured as sort of being thought of as sort of a free market fundamentalist, but his contributions were very broad, very vast. And hopefully we'll talk a little bit about that today.
Now, I've got to say, the way I learned about Friedrich Hayek was in the same way that many others may have, and that's kind of understanding him as being the sort of intellectual counterpart or opponent to Keynes, and that both Keynes and Hayek had largely differing views between how, the central government should be involved in either stimulating the economy or, as Hayek's views are kind of portrayed, as stepping back and letting the free market operate by itself. And, there was a big division between them two around the Great Depression and during those times. Of course, as you've pointed out, Hayek's work extends way beyond that, because as I've become more familiar with him, he's made these massive contributions in, like you said, psychology and political theory. But maybe we should focus a little bit on this debate between Keynes and Hayek and how that debate took shape and the differing views between each of these two really important economic figures.
Well, Hayek first came to international attention when he moved from Vienna, which is where his beginnings were in Austria, to London. He was invited to become a lecturer at the London School of Economics, and he brought forth a series of ideas there that became a bit of a sensation and garnered a lot of attention while his first couple of years while he was in London. One of the things that he did is that he actually openly criticized John Maynard Keynes, who was the most famous economist in England at the time. And so there was a bit of a debate that took place between them. Most of the debate actually didn't take place directly between them. They personally were actually quite friendly to one another. They actually enjoyed quite a pleasant personal relationship. A lot of the nasty debate actually happened between some of their proxies. In other words, some of Hayek's followers, or in particular some of John Maynard Keynes's followers, who argued either directly against Hayek or against some of Hayek's followers. So in terms of what was going on at the time, during the 1930s, The world had just entered into the Great Depression, which basically sort of lingered on all throughout the 1930s and right up until the beginning of World War II. And here, I think it's important to realize sort of a couple of distinctions. Now, Hayek did have fundamentally different views from Keynes in that he felt that some of Keynes's solutions, even if they did help things in the short run, would likely make things worse in the long run, both in terms of creating a government that would be larger than would probably be ideal, and a government that would probably start infringing upon individual liberties and upon the market process more than would be ideal. And he was also afraid of the inflationary consequences that some of Keynes's policies would have in the long run. Having said that, I think some of the differences between the two of them have been a little bit exaggerated over the years. Hayek was actually in favor of some level of government intervention into the economy. He was in favor of some of the key institutions of the welfare state as we know it today. He believed that there was a role for the government providing, for example, sort of a minimum income guarantee, a role for some minimal level of government-provided health care, and some level of management by a central bank. These are all positions that are anathema to sort of libertarians or hardcore or sort of free market advocates today.
Let me just stop you right there real quick, because I do want to say, if I'm correct, those were some of the things that Soros was basically saying in his speech at the Cato Institute in characterizing Hayek as this market fundamentalist where, you know, any intervention by the government into the market is going to lead to non-optimal solutions, or however you want to put it. Is that correct?
That's right. I think that Soros fell for the popular perception of Hayek rather than the substance of Hayek. Hayek advocated quite a few very limited roles for government, certain types of limited intervention, certain types of, say, limited welfare state. And a lot of people haven't really wanted to pay attention to that, but that was actually something that he believed in pretty much throughout his career and just hasn't been quite emphasized enough. So that's why I was saying a little bit earlier that I think while the differences between Keynes and Hayek were certainly very great, I think that it's easy to potentially exaggerate some of these differences. The other thing that I think is interesting about the Keynes debate with Hayek is that it's actually taken on greater importance today than it actually had at the time. At the time, Hayek, you could argue, was arguing for things sort of ahead of his time. At the time, the world economy was sort of immersed in a major crisis, and there was a sense that something needed to be done. Government needed to do something to intervene to turn things around. And then, of course, World War II came, and obviously during, a world war, the government is going to be in charge of the economy. So Hayek's ideas, in some sense, really didn't become truly relevant until after the war, when what happened was that the sort of centrally planned war economy continued after the war. And what Hayek did was to say, look, we need to go back to a more free market type of economy if we want to have great prosperity after the war. If we continue to have a centrally planned war economy after the war, we're going to end up being poor. And that was the message that Hayek proclaimed in his most famous book, by far his most famous book, which is called The Road to Serfdom. Hayek wrote The Road to Serfdom because he was afraid that the centrally planned war economy would sort of perpetuate itself and essentially snuff out a lot of the virtues, and a lot of the benefits that would be brought about by a more free market system. And he was very prophetic in some of his warnings about some of the problems that could be created by an overly interventionist state. And those, let's say, somewhat prophetic warnings really played themselves out in England, which is where he was at the time, where the British economy really stagnated and did poorly after the war, pretty much right up until the time that Margaret Thatcher took power in the late 70s. And interestingly, when in the middle of a heated debate at one time, Thatcher, was asked, well, what is it that you believe? And she took out of her purse a copy of The Road to Serfdom and banged it on the table and said, this is what we believe. So his book was incredibly influential on Thatcher, and it was incredibly influential basically on what happened to the world after sort of the late 70s. But it was influential precisely because of some of the failures of quasi-socialism, if you will, that happened after the war. And so Hayek actually became much more influential, as I'm trying to point out, sort of after some of the experiments with high levels of government intervention sort of proved him to be right.
Well, it's interesting because I'm just thinking, Eisenhower talking about the military-industrial complex, and that's somewhat related to the government controlling a large amount of the economy and taking over, in that sense, a lot of the industrial capacity of the U.S. economy.
Correct. During the war, there was rationing. Basically, the amount of sugar or coffee that any given family could consume was, strictly controlled during the wartime. The exact amount of different types of products were controlled by the government. It's really easy to kind of lose sight of what happened during World War II. I mean, World War II, the U.S. economy and the economy of England and the economy of the quote-unquote free world essentially became communist-type economies where just about everything had to be controlled for the benefit of the war effort. The problem is that once you put all these bureaucrats in charge of the entire economy, it's kind of hard to sort of wrest the power back from them. And the post-war presented a lot of problems in that the entire economy had been so oriented towards the war. And for example, the entire male population was basically dedicated to soldiering. What were we going to do with all these soldiers when they came back home? And what were we going to do to redirect production away from producing tanks and machine guns and so forth and to getting a peacetime economy? So at that time, it also seemed to be a great need for government to kind of intervene, to kind of transition out of a war economy. But that's, again, where Hayek came in and warned that if we didn't move decisively towards lessening the degree of government intervention, that the Western world would become much less prosperous.
You're talking about how Hayek had argued against sort of the central planning model, and he was much more favored towards free markets. What was the framework for which he believed that was the optimum way to see the economy function? Because it seems like it came a little bit from his psychological background, which is sort of where he first started, if I understand things correctly. He was doing a lot of work on the brain and how neurons fire when this was a pretty new field. And then that's kind of what led him off into a lot of these other areas as well.
It's very interesting. Hayek had a very deep interest in psychology very early on in his career as an undergraduate. In fact, early in his undergraduate career, he was actually thinking about becoming a psychologist. He later on ended up getting a law degree, and then after that, he ended up getting his doctorate in economics. But before that, he had gotten a doctorate in law. So he also had a very broad education. And you're right that Hayek's sort of psychological theories, which he expressed most fully in a book called The Sensory Order, which he published in 1952, did have an important influence on his economic thought, on his political thought, on a lot of different things. But I think that, a good place to start in terms of just grasping why sort of Hayek believed that a free market was likely, in most cases, to produce better results than a centrally planned economy or an overly interventionist economy can, trace back to sort of Adam Smith's idea that if you actually got the government to try to produce pins, and this was the example that Adam Smith used, a free market could produce pins a lot more efficiently and effectively than the government would, because actually to produce pins, which seems like a very simple thing, Adam Smith showed that it's actually very complicated because you have to source all the different parts to create a simple pin from a bunch of different places all around the world. And so you need to know the prices, you need to know labor inputs, you need to know tariffs, you need to know transportation costs. You would need to have so much knowledge of so many inputs to be able to make the proper decisions on how best to make a pin that, as it turns out, individuals operating in a free market with localized knowledge can actually make better decisions on the fly through that chain of production. They can actually make better decisions than a central planner could. So basically, Hayek took that basic insight by Adam Smith and really expanded upon it. and really showed how in a modern economy, basically 200 years, after Adam Smith had written The Wealth of Nations, that what Adam Smith had said was even more true today. And he sort of expanded on some of the mechanisms by which it was really almost impossible to imagine that any central planner could possibly incorporate all of the information that would be needed to produce goods and services in an effective manner. And for him, this was really something that he discussed theoretically, but for him, it was also more of an empirical matter. In other words, for Hayek wasn't so much for the free market only because it promoted liberty. A lot of people, like the free market because they think, okay, this promotes human liberty. Hayek liked human liberty, but the reason he liked it is that he actually thought it produced better economic outcomes. He actually thought that by giving entrepreneurs and individuals a wide scope of action, that they would create a system, a spontaneous order that would make much better economic decisions and much more efficient economic decisions and create a much more prosperous society than central planners could. And I think basically that was prophetic, because if we look at what happened in the Soviet Union, which was a centrally planned system, clearly the system, after it had some early successes in a sort of a simpler type of industrial economy, it really started running into problems later on as the economy became more complex. And basically the freer market economies in the United States or in some of the East Asian countries that adopted a free market system, they advanced far more than the countries that adopted a more socialist model. And it had to do with this dynamism that the free market system has, where you have individual entrepreneurs that are highly motivated essentially to make money for themselves. And they're so highly motivated to make money for themselves and to get things right that they actually figure out more productive ways to make a pin, for example, to make it better and to make it cheaper. They figure out better ways to source the raw materials you need. They figure out better ways to produce it. They figure out better techniques to distribute it. And they do this with their localized knowledge in a way that a central planner couldn't possibly have so much specialized and local knowledge as individual entrepreneurs have when they're out there trying to put food on the table for their families.
Going back to some of his other works, I know he talked about something that was called a spontaneous order. I think that we know that now probably as self-organization, I suppose. But I know that that was something that he espoused quite a bit. And then, he also talked about going back to how this relates to the ineffectiveness of central planning. The idea that knowledge is limited, that there's a computational limit to the human mind, or a limit to how much knowledge that we can attain and utilize. And that's what allowed for the success of a free market. And do you mind kind of elaborating on some of those ideas, which I know that those were pretty far ahead of his time when he first came out with those?
I think that spontaneous order is one of the really key ideas that permeates Hayek's work throughout his career. As Hayek matured, he realized that this idea of spontaneous order didn't just apply to economics. It's something that seemed to apply to a lot of other fields as well. So one of the analogies to spontaneous order is actually biological evolution, and the idea that organisms evolved in accordance to sort of what works given the environment that the particular organism happens to be in at the time. And so basically there is a process by which, through trial and error, the organic organisms essentially are able to absorb information about the environment and reproduce themselves in ways through a survival process that perfects their ability to survive in a given environment. And so organisms develop and perfect their ability to adapt in this particular way. This same idea actually works in a number of other areas. For example, language. Language is something that nobody invents it. Nobody, decides someday, hey, it would be really nice for us to have a language. Let's sit down and write a dictionary. Let's sit down and write a grammar so that this society will have a language to communicate with. That's not how language has ever worked. The way that language worked was through an evolutionary process whereby People communicated with a few hand signs and a few sounds, and those few sounds started to multiply, and people came into contact with other tribes that had other words and other sounds, and they actually then adopted those, and their own language became more rich, like the English language today, which is comprised of a number of borrowings from French, from Latin, from German, and a number of languages. These were all sort of evolutionary adaptations over time that have made the English language of today so rich as it is, and so able to sort of explain and describe things far better than, let's say, a language that might have been developed on a remote island in the Pacific. And the reason that the English language, in fact, is so rich is that it had so many different inputs from so many different places. And because it was actually allowed to evolve in essentially a free way, where essentially speakers adopted a word, and if basically that word was descriptive and people felt that the word adequately described a phenomenon, then people freely adopted the use of that term. There was no government telling them that they needed to use that word. And so this idea basically also applies to political institutions and laws. And Hayek believed that a lot of the liberal institutions and the free market institutions that had been developed in England and the United States and the Western world more generally had been evolved over a process of hundreds of years, through a process of trial and error, through trying different things, failing, learning from those failures, adapting things that actually worked. And this is actually how the common law evolves, where you have judges that take individual cases where you have conflicts between, let's say, two people that are fighting something out in a court. And a judge basically has to decide on how to adjudicate that particular dispute. And over time, you end up building up a body of law that really is successful at resolving a lot of the problems that come up in the day-to-day management of society.
You know, that's interesting. I just want to tie this in a little bit because, you know, you're talking about language and law, and we're talking about the market and how Hayek viewed all of these things. And I guess essentially it's kind of looking at these societal processes from the point of view of, I would say, an organism, or from an organic bottom-up process rather than the top-down kind of model. I guess in a simple way of thinking about it, really what Hayek was articulating was this very powerful bottom-up process, and how spontaneous order comes about from all these interactions that take place, whether it's through, you know, neurons, or whether it's through individuals, whether it's through people putting forth contracts in a legal sense, whether it's even through language, trying to figure out the best word to use and associating to a certain concept or whatever it is in the environment. Is that kind of how this all ties in, I suppose?
Basically, what Hayek believed is that society should give individuals a maximum amount of leeway to essentially find or allow to emerge solutions to the problems that they have through sort of spontaneous interactions by entrepreneurs or people that are essentially trying to solve problems on their own. So whether it be a writer who's writing a book and is trying to figure out the best way to express something, Hayek said it wouldn't be very effective to essentially tie the hands of the writer and force him to write using certain words and certain sentence structures and so forth. Let's let a lot of different writers write differently, and over time we'll actually build up a language that'll be more effective than if any one person actually invented it. Same with law, and the same with the economy. Now, Hayek recognized that there were certain dangers to this and certain limits to this, because when you allow things to spontaneously emerge and to spontaneously happen, there's obviously no guarantee that at any given point in time things are going to actually turn out the way you want them to. The whole process can kind of veer off into undesired directions at times. But the thing is that Hayek said and emphasizes that we don't know ahead of time exactly what is a direction that's veering off into a wrong direction or right direction. If we knew ahead of time exactly what we needed to do in advance to achieve our objectives, then human advancement and economic growth would be easy. But the reality is, let's say use a modern example, we don't really know if the technology that Tesla is developing is going to be the ultimate solution to some of our transportation problems and some of our energy problems, whether solar is going to be the answer to our problems, whether it's going to be some sort of altered form of conventional energy like natural gas. In other words, it's impossible to know in advance exactly how technology is going to evolve, how society is going to evolve. And so we have to give entrepreneurs and the economic system a great deal of leeway so that entrepreneurs who are motivated to essentially provide products and services that people want and need, allow them the greatest possible leeway to actually produce these products and services with the greatest possible quality and at the lowest possible cost. And through the process of competition, eventually the best solutions will tend to emerge from that. But he was under no illusions that this was going to be a perfect type of process where we weren't going to run into bumps along the road. Along the way, bubbles can inflate, people can go down blind alleys and arrive at dead ends, recessions are going to happen, stock market crashes are going to happen. All these things are going to happen. But if we design our economic system in the fear of preventing all these negative things that happen in a free market society, we will also lose out on the greater benefits that a free market society is likely to provide and which has provided over the last 200-300 years. And let's be clear, the reality is that humanity has produced more material well-being in the last 300 years of history than in the entire 10,000 or 100,000 years of human history that came before it. Basically, this explosion in material well-being is something that was intimately tied to the liberalizing of economies and to the sort of unleashing of these entrepreneurial forces in society. And Hayek recognized that, and he tried to encourage not sort of necessarily a kind of a savage capitalism, but he did try to encourage societies to give the free market and to give entrepreneurs a very wide scope to be able to come up with, and in competition with each other, come up with the best possible solutions that were pressing society at the time.
Yeah, so this brings up an interesting interview that I did before with a lady by the name of Carlota Perez, and she had written a pretty famous book called Technological Revolutions and Financial Capital, The Dynamics of Bubbles and Golden Ages. And what you said brought to mind that interview with her because, basically she had explained how there's this cyclical component of bubbles where you see periodicity of bubbles like every 50 to 60 years where you'll see a technology that's developed and then all of a sudden you see one technology that sort of takes hold. Like, you're talking about Tesla, for example, or solar power. We don't know which one of those is going to end up working out to be successful. But then eventually there's a leader that emerges. And then when that happens, you see a lot of financial capital just directed towards that. And then that ends up driving a massive bubble like we saw with the tech bubble. And then there's a collapse. And then after that happens, reality sort of sets in, and then you see this slow economic expansion or the application of that technology into the economy until the same thing occurs over and over and over. And we've seen that since the Industrial Revolution. So this kind of relates to what Hayek was talking about, what you said. I guess my question would be, Hayek worked a lot on business cycle theory and what causes business cycles. And clearly there's this idea of bubbles that develop within the business cycle as well. Would Hayek say that, or did he say that bubbles are simply the result of central planners perhaps intervening in the economy? Or was there something more fundamental that was at work that is perhaps part of the societal process itself?
Yeah, that's a great question, Chris. We could say that there was two ways to approach this and two strains of thought, which you have actually alluded to in developing the question you just asked. The first is, I think that Hayek wasn't under any illusions, and he would never suggest that it would be impossible for bubbles to emerge on their own, even in the absence of central planning or central banking. And by the way, Hayek did not believe that central banking was necessarily a form of central planning. That's sort of a slogan that people have been using today, kind of comparing central banking to central planning. Hayek didn't actually propose that idea. Hayek I think, understood that if you allow markets to be relatively free, that business cycles could happen. You could have bubbles, you could have crashes. So to answer that part of your question, there is sort of a primeval force that's at work. And I think that what Hayek would say is that if we're going to benefit in the long run from a free enterprise type system, that's one of the costs that we're going to have to be willing to bear. However, having said that, one of the key things that Hayek did in his business cycle theory, and really the most important part of his business cycle theory, was to emphasize the role of monetary policy in the sort of creation and, let's say, magnification of bubbles. Hayek was concerned that central banks pumping too much money into the financial system, that, let's say, these primeval impulses that you've just described would tend to get magnified, and that they would create distortions and create what he called malinvestment, where a lot of newly sort of created capital, particularly through the credit system, by the central bank, let's say, holding interest rates too low, it would tend to stimulate the growth of credit at too fast of a rate, and this credit would tend to move towards sort of hot sectors, kind of the way you described. So capital would get misallocated through excessive enthusiasm or irrational exuberance or directed towards particular projects or plans, and that, as a result, eventually there would be some sort of a formation of a bubble and then a crash that would cause a depression or a major recession. And Hayek was concerned about the government's role, or more specifically, the central bank's role in inflating these types of bubbles, and therefore the negative consequences of the aftermath of these bubbles. And so his work on business cycle theory really emphasized sort of the dangers, if you will, of central banks having overly easy monetary policy and how that could actually create problems down the line. Now, having said that, I'd like to just insert a note of my own here. I don't have any way of knowing whether Hayek would actually agree with this or not, because he didn't actually ever specifically speak to this, I think. But I think that if we review the history of capitalist development, and I would say even more particularly so in the United States, the history of material progress in the United States is largely a history of bubbles. The very first bubbles that emerged in the United States happened soon after the adoption of the U.S. Constitution and the creation of the first Bank of the United States, which brought about a very large expansion of credit, which was also associated with a sort of capital flight from Europe because the Napoleonic Wars were happening in Europe, and so a lot of capital actually flowed to the United States. There was huge amounts of land speculation and speculations of other sort, which actually ended up in a crash. We saw a very similar thing in the 1820s, where land banks were created in the United States, where people were given loans at extremely low interest or essentially no interest loans, and also given loans to actually buy equipment and other stuff that was needed to work the land. That actually helped inflate land prices in the United States, and that created a bubble and a crash. And essentially, I could go on here and name to you at least 10 different bubble episodes in U.S. economic history. But the interesting thing about that is that we always talk about bubbles as being such a terrible and such a bad thing. Because if you think about it, well, a bubble explodes, and that leads to a lot of bad stuff. People become unemployed, people, go bankrupt and so forth. But what we're not really seeing is that the bubble itself allowed the creation of a tremendous amount of capital. And the United States would never have developed as quickly as it did if it hadn't been for these massive bubbles that periodically arose and essentially spurred the colonization of the West and the settling of the West of the United States, that caused the creation of, massive amounts of industry in the United States. There were bubble processes, the creation and the expansion of railroads in the United States. As you know, there was a huge bubble surrounding that. And so bubbles have actually been an integral part of the story of economic growth in the United States. And so I think we have to be a little bit careful about this idea of snuffing out bubbles every time we think that there might be one going on. Because by trying too hard to snuff out bubbles, quote unquote, we may be cheating ourselves out of the prosperity for the future. And I think that this ties in, ironically, like I said, I don't know if Hayek would actually agree with what I'm saying right now, but it's not contradictory to what he said, because Hayek always emphasizes we don't really know the future. We can't really know in advance whether a lot of the investment that's happening in areas that we think are a bubble, if they may actually subsequently turn out to be very justified. I mean, we saw that in the tech bubble. Sure, there was a lot of money that was wasted in the tech bubble, but there was also huge, massively productive investments that came about as a result of the tech bubble of the late 1990s. And we probably wouldn't be as prosperous as we are as a nation, or the United States wouldn't be as prosperous as it is as a nation if that quote-unquote tech bubble had not happened. If some government bureaucrat had decided to squash all the tech IPOs coming out in the late 90s, where would we be today? So I think that we have to be very careful about railing against bubbles and being too activist in trying to prevent them, because what we're doing, in fact, is what Hayek would call a fatal conceit. In other words, we're assigning to ourselves, by saying that, for example, investment in solar energy is a bubble, just to give an example, is essentially assigning to ourselves the ability to foresee the future and to be able to say that, hey, solar energy isn't really the solution to the future. How do we know it's not going to be the solution to the future? Maybe it is. And maybe it's actually the entrepreneurs who are actually working on these technologies, and the scientists and all the people that are on the ground and are working on this feverishly. Maybe all this is going to actually lead us to a much better sort of energy production system than we have right now. And if we actually try to snuff that out by, again, if we have a government bureaucrat somewhere out there, trying to snuff this out, saying, oh, this is a bubble, then I think that we might actually be potentially cheating ourselves out of something that could be extremely important. So this area of bubbles, I think, poses a very interesting challenge for free market-minded and free market-oriented people, because on the one hand, a lot of free market-oriented people are kind of, let's say, averse towards bubbles. They feel like bubbles are things that are promoted by the government and fueled by central banks and so forth. But on the other hand, history really shows us that bubbles have been an integral part of the development of prosperity in the United States. And this is kind of a very interesting dilemma. And I think, one of the things that really made Hayek great as an economist was his great flexibility. He wasn't ideological. He wasn't somebody who said, yes, absolutely, everything has to be free market and libertarian, or no, the government definitely has to be involved in this. For example, Hayek early in his career believed that central banking was absolutely necessary and crucial for the development of a market economy. He had certain ideas about how the central bank should be managed, but he definitely believed that a central bank was necessary. However, later in his career, he actually developed certain ideas that became very influential later on that actually said, well, there are certain circumstances under which it's possible to imagine a competitive system of currencies emerging. And he kind of, in a way, foresaw this idea of Bitcoin, the idea that maybe private issuers of currencies could actually emerge to come out and compete against central banks, and that might actually potentially create a more perfect currency system in the long run if we actually enable competition amongst different currencies. I don't want to go too far into that debate right now, Chris, but the only thing I want to point out here is that Hayek had an incredibly flexible mind and was somebody who was very pragmatic and was able to kind of see issues from multiple sides. And he saw a lot of the dilemmas and complexities that come about when you try to solve economic problems. And he understood that free market capitalism, certain issues or problems come up in the course of the development of free market capitalism, and some of those problems have to be addressed in an effective and a timely manner. And that's why we need smart people, both entrepreneurs and policymakers, to make reasonable and smart decisions as we move along. And we can't just follow some sort of script, an ideological script, and hope to achieve the best possible results. To a large extent, the best solution to any given economic problem is going to depend upon the circumstances at the time. Hayek believed that we should accord a sort of benefit of the doubt to market processes, because he believed that more likely than not, market processes would lead to better economic outcomes. but he was also open to the possibility that in certain situations and in certain circumstances, it might be better to be a little creative, and there might be some leeway towards approaching things in a slightly different way.
So that concludes part 1 of my interview with James Castorius on Friedrich Hayek. Friedrich Hayek is really an intellectual giant in not just the world of economics, but also, as we pointed out, in political theory, and even when it comes to understanding how the brain works. We didn't really elaborate too much on that, but he'd written a lot through his book, The Sensory Order, and a lot of his concepts are still even affecting neuroscience to this day, which is very fascinating. In part 2, we're going to go a little bit more into the role that the central bank and governments should play in trying to prevent bubbles. We're going to discuss that a little bit more. We're also going to get into the efficient market hypothesis. And that was something that Soros tried to link Hayek to. And so we're going to kind of discuss that and whether or not Hayek should be considered an advocate of the efficient market hypothesis, or the EMH. We're also going to talk a little bit about the wisdom of the crowd versus the madness of the crowd, and kind of how you see the market vacillate between those two. We're going to get into why Hayek is even strongly disliked by certain groups, some staunch free market libertarians, which he's sometimes associated to, but a lot of his views don't necessarily jive with a number of different groups. And we're going to touch on a number of different other topics that I think you'll really find interesting. So that concludes part 1. Be sure to listen to part 2 tomorrow. I'm Cris Sheridan. You're listening to Financial Sense News Hour at financialsense.com.
You can subscribe to Financial Sense News Hour in the iTunes and BlackBerry podcast libraries, or at feeds.feedburner.com/FSN. Find more information about our guests at www.financialsense.com/newshour. Friend us at www.facebook.com/financialsenseonline. For our on-the-go listeners, you can access Financial Sense on your mobile device at m.financialsense.com. The Financial Sense News Hour is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered as a solicitation or offer to purchase or sell any securities. The investments, investment strategies, and investment philosophies discussed or presented on the News Hour each involve their own unique risk factors, which are not discussed on the show. Responses to listener inquiries are based on the personal opinions of James Poplava and do not take into account listeners' suitability, objectives, or risk tolerance. Financial Sense News Hour and its parent company shall not be liable for any financial losses that result from investing in any companies profiled on or advertising with Financial Sense, or arising out of the use of any material on the News Hour. Be advised that you invest at your own risk.